Brilliant. Thank you, Michaela. I am absolutely delighted to be here and lovely to see the team back at Leading to Change again and to see all the great work that's happening. I'm trying not to be intimidated by the numbers that are here, but delighted that you all thought this would be of interest. I realise it's lunchtime and some of you may well be listening as opposed to sitting at your computers and watching. So I just have a few slides which are as much just to keep me on the right track as anything else, but I know you'll get copies of these in the recording as well. So in this session, as Michaela said, I'm going to be looking at compassionate leadership, but looking at through the sort of lens of resilience, which is what my doctoral studies were about. But before that, I want to sort of take you through a little bit of my story about why resilience was of interest to me. But even before that, I want to say a few words about a leader who just embodied compassionate leadership. And she did the very last talk in this series, Audrey Burt. Those of you who were at that session knew that Audrey had been fighting a life-limiting condition for quite a number of years, and sadly passed away recently, and our funeral's tomorrow. So I just wanted to pay a little bit of a tribute to Audrey before I went on with my talk. And she talked about her journey to better times. And she was a total inspiration in terms of going through her own journey, which must have really impacted on her own resilience. But she spent so much of her time sharing her wisdom, her learning, and her compassion. I first met Audrey when she was a new chief exec of Breast Cancer Now. She was a nurse in a previous life. And she was just an amazing leader. We then worked for a while together down at the Windsor Leadership Programme on their dialogue group. And it was really Audrey that taught me about mindfulness. For somebody who runs about doing a million things at once, actually taking time to be a bit more mindful was something that Audrey really helped me consider and understand. And I think both her blog and her book was her way of actually sharing the learning she had, both from dealing with such strength with her condition and also the learning from her experience as a leader and a coach and facilitator and all the roles that she had. So I just wanted to start by just saying what an amazing woman Audrey was, and someone that we can all learn from. And thank you for all the nice emojis that are coming up on that. So back to my story. And I suppose I just wanted to say a few words first about why resilience was basically something that I wanted to study. And it was from two angles. It was both from a personal perspective and a professional perspective. So to start with a very quick run through of the personal. I first started thinking about resilience from a personal perspective in 2016 when my late husband and I decided we would do a world travel, take some time out. And the long story short is that he very sadly became ill during that time and had to be airlifted off a mountain and was in hospital in New Zealand for quite some time. Sadly, it turned out he had cancer, and after spending some time in New Zealand, came home and sadly passed away. So the challenge of dealing with that on a personal basis, when having to go back as a leader of an organisation that was supporting other leaders, was something that it was really fascinating finding where I found strength throughout that time as a leader, and thinking about that both through how I managed to do that at work and how I did that in my personal life with my family. So I'd written a little bit about that at the time. And I sort of, one of the ways I've talked about it before, I bounced between wanting to be a beach bum and just run away and travel the world and not think about anything else for a while, and really throw myself into work. And I think I did a bit. I didn't go and travel the world and be a beach bum, although I do like my travels still. Um, I threw myself into work in lots of different ways. I became more interested in resilience. I started studying it a little bit more. And I also thought there was something about those that actually practiced leadership and the academic world that were quite different, and there was quite a lot of space between them. One of the things I've been really interesting is the connections and learning across different sectors. And I've been lucky enough to work in the private, the third sector, and the public sector. But I hadn't had any real foray into academia. I studied a master's about 20 years previously, but it had been a long time, and I'd done that while working full time as well. So I got a group of third sector leaders together who were of a similar mind, and we looked at whether we could get a group of us that could follow through with some of our thinking and our studies. And to cut another long story short, myself and two others from the sector ended up doing our doctoral studies. And it was like learning a new language, absolutely fascinating. The resilience challenge came back. So I'd already chosen resilience, leadership resilience in the charity sector, and what keeps leaders resilient was something that I wanted to study. But within the first, I think, 3 or 4 months of starting my studies, COVID hit. And it seemed rather apt that I was studying resilience at that time. So I was doing a doctorate, working full time as a chief exec, suddenly having to totally turn around what we did to online, and help support my team, my staff, and as we all do, wider family and friends, and also again draw lots of strength from that too. And I was on a board. I was vice chair of Oscar, the charity regulator. Sadly, the chair took ill around that time, and I had to step up as chair. And I was starting a new doctorate and trying to learn about that. Very sadly, in the first few weeks of COVID, my sister passed away as well, who'd taken ill not long before. So it was just a really, really challenging time. And again, I probably found my solace in mainly people, but also keeping busy. So to some extent, that's what led me to this point. Both the professional and the personal. I could see the challenge that sector leaders were having at that time. They were being asked to do more and more. Those that were working on the front line, supporting people in communities, were suddenly having to really up their game, but deal with all the other challenges of sick family members, kids at home, etc., etc. So, resilience was very challenged. But at the same time, we all wanted to be compassionate leaders. We could see the challenges our teams were having. We really wanted to be there for them, to support them. And it was, every day was trying to learn something new. And it was, I suppose, the other thing that I reflected on when I was pulling this talk together was that whole learning from different sectors, and some of the learning I gained from working with the team at NES, from my own experiences of working with care services within the NHS and elsewhere, and how they could be so different in so different places. A very brief example, when I was in New Zealand with my husband, who was in intensive care for a while, when he came out of that and went into high dependency, as relatives, we were actually very, very involved in the care, and that made a huge difference to me. We were shown where the gowns are, where the showers were, where the small kitchen was, so we could get glasses of water, yogurt if someone was hungry. We were encouraged to take the patient out with all their equipment every day to get a little bit of space outside. And actually made me feel I could do something, but also meant the nurses could actually focus on what they were trained to do and not just bringing glasses of water. So it was fascinating seeing how that could be possible one place, but potentially very different in other places. And that's not to take anything at all from our NHS here, which is absolutely amazing. But there was just a very different approach and a different risk appetite in the different places. So that was something that it made me reflect on. So that's a bit of a background to why I started on studying resilience, which I will come back to, but I want to move now because what we want to now do is start to look at compassionate leadership, but through the lens of resilience. So Michaela's very kindly put together a word cloud, or poll that you can actually, I'd like you to maybe try and do one word. What does compassion or compassionate leadership mean to you? And just see what that word brings up for people if you're thinking about it from a leadership perspective. And that's leadership, whether it's a sort of formal leadership role or just as a leader in any role that you play. If you are not able to access the poll, you can equally put your answers in the chat. And I think once we've done that, I think Michaela might come in and just say a little bit about what the sort of key topics that are coming through are. Just give it a little bit of a minute or two, because I've got quite strong views about how we manage to be compassionate and resilient at the same time as a leader. Michaela.
Yes, thank you very much. So far, we have 165 responses, and I think the key word that has been used from most of us is the word empathy. Some other words that are very common is listening, understanding, attending, shared humanity, kindness, willingness to listen, listening to understand, being mindful and supportive. So it's very, again, person-centered, giving time, understanding, and again, anything you put in the chat, we'll do another word cloud later on. So if this doesn't work for you, you can put the responses in the chat and we can put them in, and we'll share the word clouds later on. But thank you so much for everyone's responses so far.
Thanks very much, Michaela. If we could maybe just go to the next slide now. I'll sort of pick up because sorry, I'm just going to close the word cloud. On the behaviours, so Atkins and Parker came up with these 4 behaviours of being a compassionate leader, which I thought was really interesting, and I won't go into their definitions, but you can explore them if you like. But attending is about being present and focusing on other people. Understanding is about taking time to explore what their issues are and to really understand where they're coming from. Empathizing is to some extent mirror their distress so that you can understand it and feel it, but to try not to feel overwhelmed yourself. And helping, they say, is taking, once you've done the first 3, is to then take thoughtful and intelligent action. And if we maybe move to the next slide. So this slide is one of leadership complexity, specifically in the third sector, but I think it could be any sector. So in this situation, the chief exec or the leader would be in the middle. And it's that challenge of trying to be all things to all people at all time. So if you're trying to very much be a leader with empathy and compassion and understanding, you're trying to do that to your stakeholders, to the people that you are there to serve, whether that's your community, your patients, your clients. You're there for a reason to support the people that you're there to be there for. But you're also there to be there for your staff and the team that are doing that in the front line. But you're also making sure the organisation is in a fit place, or your department or your team are in a fit place to do that work on the front line. And there will also be the rules, the regulation, the governance, and the management. So you're trying to support people in all different directions. And to maybe give you an example from the third sector, I remember during COVID working with a staff team that were all incredibly stressed. And they had lots of different things going on at that time. They were needing some time off, they were needing a break. We were also trying to turn our organisation around and be there to support the other 700 leaders we were working with to actually do the best job they could. And they were needing more help than ever. And you can imagine this from a frontline perspective as well. If you're managing to deliver food to houses, people who can't go outside and are vulnerable, you want that delivery to still happen. So how do you make sure that that service is still delivered with a team that is fully stressed and needing a break? So you cannot please all of the people all of the time. So as a leader in that situation, to please all of those people and to be compassionate to all of those different draws on your time, it's very hard to think about how you stay resilient yourself while you're trying to give yourself to others. And I think for many leaders, that is the real challenge. And one of the things I say was my biggest learning point as a leader is that you cannot please all of the people all of the time without burning out yourself, and then you can't please any of the people. So how do you start thinking about how you look after yourself to be able to have that capacity to be compassionate to others that you're working with? So could we maybe move to the next slide? And this is one of my favourite images for those that are looking at the screen. And I'll say a little bit because after my doctorate, I then wanted to be able to share some of what I'd learned in a much more accessible manner than a 50,000 word thesis. So the first chapter in the book that I've just written is called We Make Plans and the Gods Laugh. So for anyone who's not seeing the screen, we've got someone going along a very straight path with a very clear destination. And that tends to be what our plan is. We think, okay, we'll do this, write it all down on a bit of paper. We know where we want to go, what we want to do. And the reality ends up full of mountains and potholes and every obstacle known to man. And that's why our resilience is challenged. And one of the things I got challenged with when I started my studies, when I first talked to some academics about, studying resilience, I got, it's a bit of a flawed concept these days. Surely if you look after your well-being, you don't have to be resilient because, you'll be very strong and you'll be able to deal with anything. And to some extent, obviously, looking after your well-being is going to help, but there is always going to be setbacks, challenges that you have to deal with. And the way I now think of it is, you're going to have that dip. Resilience is the ability to bounce back after a setback. But how do you make the hole that you fall down not quite so deep and the climb back out of it a little bit easier? And that's where we start thinking about how we can look after ourselves, try and mitigate some of the risk of burnout and actually be able to bounce back without having to bounce so hard. So that's sort of where I started to go with my studies. So we could pop to the next one. And one of the things I often talk about is the juggling act that we play as leaders. I've showed you the image earlier that showed how it all interacts with the leader in the middle. But there was a report some time ago that likened leadership in the charity sector as juggling while riding a unicycle, which for me is a picture. I'm very visual in the way that I think, and it's a picture that's definitely stuck with me, because you're juggling all the balls, you're trying to keep the unicycle upright, and you're trying to keep going in the right direction towards your goal. And trying to do all those things at once is a challenge in itself. But to some extent, the bigger challenge is if you drop one of those balls, it tends to be the ball that you drop that people notice, not the fact that you've still got quite a few of them still in the air and you're still keeping the unicycle upright and going in the right direction. So that's certainly one of the challenges when you're in the public eye, is trying to keep the focus on what you're still achieving and not the one ball that you've maybe dropped. And one of the analogies that I really like is the one of thinking about which are the glass balls. If you've got an awful lot of things that you're juggling, some of them will be rubber balls. And if you let them drop, they'll bounce and you can pick them back up again. But you might have one or two glass balls that are in that juggling act. And those are the ones that, you can sacrifice a couple of the rubber balls to make sure the glass balls are looked after. So that sometimes helps me in terms of prioritizing where my focus is, in terms of keeping everything going when my resilience is challenged. Okay, we can move on. So I've got another wee word cloud so that I can take breath for a second. And before I move on to my research and to talk a wee bit about resilience, it'd be really good if you could have a little think about what one thing keeps you resilient at work. I'll just give you a few seconds to put something down. And again, use the chat if you need to. Hi, Michaela. I'm afraid I don't see them all when they're coming in.
Don't worry, I can see them. So the key word so far, the biggest one, is peer support and colleagues. Some other words that we see is laughter, humor, personal life, self-care. The word humor has come up a few times in different versions. A good team, good line manager, how they say that people join organizations and leave line managers. Another idea, looking at resilience path, is we've talked about this when I'm preparing for the session, is about very often even the word resilience seems to be a very stigmatized word, and a very nice definition I've heard was resilience is not how you endure, but how you replenish, how do you re-energize. So how can we as leaders use those practices, that the examples that we've got up there, to bounce back, as you've said. Communication with the team. Again, realistic expectations is one of them coming up. Discussions with colleagues, family support, time, laughter, lots of lovely ideas. And if you would like to close the poll, you can just press the little X in the right-hand side corner.
Great, thanks, Michaela. And that's really interesting because that's very, very similar to some of what I found in the research. So if we could just move to the next slide. So this is the sort of summary of my 50,000 word thesis. You'll be pleased to hear. It's one easy way of getting the message over, if you like. So what I entitled my study was Holistic Leadership Resilience. And holistic for an interesting reason. So I was interviewing leaders about what kept them resilient in their leadership role. So I presumed they would be coming back with things that were work-related. And I'd also specifically asked them what behaviours kept them resilient, because I was really interested in things that you do, so that those were things that you could change. And being new to academia, I got lots and lots and lots of different answers. I interviewed some amazing, fascinating people, got a huge data set, and then really struggled to know what to do with it. Because although I asked what keeps you resilient, I didn't specifically say in your role, but I was interviewing them as leaders in a particular role. But what came back wasn't all behaviours. And at first I thought, okay, well, I don't count those other things that came in because they're not behaviours. But then I thought, well, actually, if I'm asking them what keeps them resilient and they come back with this answer, then surely that's what comes into mind. So I should take it into account. So I then started to sort of group what the other things were and put them into two categories. So one was mindsets and one was factors. And I came up with this quite simplistic equation of holistic resilience is the sum of behaviours, mindsets, and factors. And all of these have a part to play. Behaviours being things that you do, mindsets being the way that you think, and factors being the environment that you work in. So people would say to me, what keeps you resilient? Oh, knowing that the funding's coming. That isn't specifically a behaviour, but it's obviously a big part of who they, what they need to make them feel resilient. In terms of mindsets, people would say things like, oh, it's keeps me resilient. Oh, it's being confident that I know how to deal with something. Again, confidence is more a mindset and a behaviour, but I'll go into that in a bit more detail. So that was one of the interesting facts, was that it wasn't just behaviours. It was much more holistic than that. But also, a huge percentage of the answers weren't just about work. People would say it's about going home and playing with the kids, taking the dog for a walk, digging the garden, which again was quite a surprise for me, because I presumed, because I was asking them about their leadership role and what kept them resilient, that they would say, oh, it's about having a great team, or having a strategic plan, or knowing what our goals and objectives were. But it wasn't. It was things like going to the pub and having a laugh with my friends. Humour came up. Peer support came up hugely. And there's a lot of the things that were emotional, there were physical things that you did, and there were social interactions, and they happened at work, at home, and when out doing leisure activities. So maybe I was naive with my very narrow thinking at the start, but it was fascinating to think, well, actually, it's not things at work that are keeping me going, it's everything else around me. So we could maybe go to the next slide. I'll just maybe go into a little bit more detail about that, which I think we have a little bit of time for. So these were the sort of key things that came up in each of those categories. Things that we do, the behaviours, acceptance of non-perfection came up. I think there was a whole thing about it's okay to not get it right every time. And sometimes we, certainly in all of the professions that you are sort of held to account, and there's risks of getting things wrong. There's a real risk, especially if you want to try something new. So it's being kind to yourself, which I know in a lot of environments is really difficult, about knowing that you won't always get it right, because it seemed to be that people were their own worst critics. And peer support, not surprisingly, came up as one of the first responses to the word cloud. So finding your tribe. And that was often lots of different tribes. Because that was finding your peer group, either at your, I don't know, when you go running, you might have a group that you share with. It's when you go to your pubs with your mates, but equally it might be your team who are very much your peers. Or it might be a leadership organisation where you all come together and share. So it was not just one tribe, it was lots of different tribes. It was also quite interesting that people talked about other experiences. It would be things like, oh, I got through a really messy divorce a couple of years ago, and knowing that I could get through something like that has made me realise that I can deal with some of the difficult stuff and I'll be able to get through this situation. There was also a big thing about asking for help. And that's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength to know that you've got peers around you who they'd probably love to be able to help you, and it would make them feel good too, and probably help their resilience to know that someone would go to them and ask for help. There was also something about knowing what works for you. And that was about, I know that if I get really stressed, I have to go for a run at the end of the day, or if I've got a strategic plan to write and I'm going to hit a deadline, I'll go out and dig the garden because that's when I do my best thinking. So people talked about what worked for them and it was different for everyone. And the overarching was that it was things that were much more holistic than just at work. It was taking a whole life approach to what keeps you resilient. Mindsets, again, I mentioned confidence, and I noticed somebody put honest in the chat, so there was something about honesty, and that was about being honest with yourself and others and having the conversations that needed to be had. There was about having a learning mindset came up, being open to learning at all times was really important. And sorry, I'm distracted by the chat. Confidence, yep, I've got that down as a mindset. And I have been challenged on some of these, but I very much gone for behaviours, things that you do, and mindsets are ways that you think. Some people said being optimistic, just glass half full. That's what gets me through. I know it's going to work. I'm going to hang on to my optimism. And being passionate about what you do. I'm sure there's a lot of people in the call today. And obviously, when I was interviewing leaders, they were there because they were passionate about the difference that they could make. And that really helped keep them going. And then there was a whole raft of different responses around being self-aware, having self-belief, reflecting, looking after yourself, knowing yourself, and also giving and getting positive feedback from others really helped, which I think as leaders is a really good one to remember. And the factors, I'm sure you all know the factors and the governance around the way that you work, and the risk appetite will all be factors involving your resilience. So the governance and the structure around you, the context, the environment. One of the ones I was a little bit challenged about where to put was trigger points, knowing what the trigger points are. Some managing organisations that have funding challenges, they knew that there would be a trigger point at the end of the financial year, or whether we're having negotiations with funders. So they knew that would be a difficult time in advance. So we'd try and get some other things out the way. So knowing when the challenging points are, or knowing when you're getting to the end of your tether and really need to go out for a walk. People talked about when they were really, really exhausted, the resilience was impacted. And they talked about the team around them and the policy environment that they worked in. And just to pick up a wee bit on Michaela's point there about resilience and behaviours, it very much came through that there was also something around it's not what you do, it's the way that you do it. And remembering that saying that, it's not actually what you say to people that they remember, it's the way you make them feel. And I think that much more holistic feeling about things certainly came through as an overview. So I think I've probably dived into the detail enough, so we could maybe move to the next one. So I maybe just wanted to say a little bit, and I sort of threw this in at the last minute because it's something that I keep coming back to in terms of the learning mindset and the appetite of risk and of learning and of trying something new. And those of you who are involved in teaching or learning will know this really well. But the 4 stages of learning are unconscious and competent. When you don't know that you don't know, You have no idea. You have no idea. And then it's conscious incompetent. So you know you're not very good. You know what you're not doing. You know it's not right. You know you need to learn more, but you're going to give it a bash. And I've realised that that's the space that I thrive in. If I had known what was involved, I would never have probably stepped into a chief exec role, stepped into board role, or even considered doing a doctorate. I go in a hazy sense of, oh, this seems like a fun adventure to have. And then realise I'm way over my head, and then take the tiniest little step towards learning and knowing. And just those little tiny steps start to help you move a wee bit into the third one of conscious competence. And that one means you sort of know what to do, but you really have to think about it. I'm currently learning Gaelic. I'm in the process of moving to the Isle of Skye. And yeah, I have a very tiny amount of Gaelic, but I have to think really, really hard to be able to actually pull out the right words. An unconscious competence is where I like to think I got to as my chief exec role within the charity sector. You know, this was my thing. I loved it. I knew how to do it. And I didn't really have to think about it. It was second nature. But I think there's a risk of getting too much into that state. I think it's always good for us to go back into the first couple to remind us that we can learn and to give us a bit of a challenge and to stretch our minds. So I'm at a different stage now in that I've finished full-time work. I'm still finding the right term for it. A colleague suggested rewired, which is quite interesting. So I'm exploring lots of different things, but hopefully if we all continue to learn, that will help us when thinking of both resilience and compassion. So I'm realizing we're coming to, yep, somebody else has come up with the rewiring. It's obviously the way to go. But there's something really important about that stage, and I'm going off track again. But in terms of your peer group, you really have to rethink. And I've actually found other people at the same stage of life as me have been incredibly helpful, just bouncing ideas of what's this stage. And I think all the stages of life, whether you're coming into a new role or moving into a new way of being, you need a different peer group at that stage. So if we could just move on to the next one. So this is my last slide where I really just wanted to bring people together. Bring people? I do want to bring people together, but I wanted to bring the themes that I talked about together. So I have spent the last year in my mad moment of unconscious incompetence. I had a bit of a whim that maybe I could turn my learning into a book so that it was easier and more accessible than having to use the academic language, which I found almost as hard as Gaelic. So the book is hopefully out by the end of the year. It's got a few different audiences probably because there's a bit of my story in it. It's also, I've written it in a way that hopefully it would be useful for anyone who's thinking of doing a doctorate. And if it's something that's sort of away in the back of your mind somewhere, I definitely recommend it, she says hesitantly after wading through treacle for a while. But I just love opening new worlds to explore, and this has opened up a new world for me to explore. But the second half of the book, I've tried to bring in some of the learning from practice. And some of that has included things like leadership exchanges from across my European work, meant that I've had exchanges across various different countries as well as different sectors, all which has been hugely fascinating, and I have learned so much. And I suppose I know we're just about in the last 10 minutes, but one of my favourite sayings that I just wanted to leave you with is that each destination is but a doorway to another journey. And this doesn't come from any lofty tomb. I think it came from a cartoon I watched with one of my kids when they were small. But it's the fact that every time you get to a certain point, whether it's finishing a doctorate, moving to a new role, that you've been working hard to get towards. It's not really just a destination. It's a springboard to something else. And you're at a different place to open a new door to another journey. And I think in terms of resilience and compassion, there's never an end point for that. You continue to learn both, you continue to juggle that balance. But I think it's just a recognition that it's very hard to do both. And we really need to look after ourselves to be compassionate to others within our role.